Dylan Carlisle was just 17 when his father remarried, bringing Angela into their quiet Ohio home. She was beautiful, younger, and eager to play the role of stepmother. But behind her warm smile hid something twisted. What began as parental affection turned into obsession. And what started in secret ended in blood. Angela Carlisle crossed every line emotionally, physically, and finally fatally. For years, she controlled Dylan's life like a puppeteer in the dark. But when her grip started to slip, her world unraveled. Was Dylan a cold-blooded killer, or the final victim of a woman who had groomed him since he was a boy? This is the disturbing true story of Dylan Carlisle and the stepmother who couldn't let him go. When James married Angela, it was supposed to be the start of something fresher, second chance at a stable, happy home. James was a 45-year-old warehouse supervisor and a single father of a teenage son. After years of loneliness and heartbreak, from a bitter divorce, James thought he'd found the perfect partner. Angela was younger, beautiful, and eager to take on a maternal role, despite never having children of her own. Two neighbors in their sleepy Ohio suburb, the new couple seemed oddly matched, but no one said it out loud. People kept their opinions, watching from behind trimmed hedges and half-drawn blinds as the Carlisles began their new life in the pale blue house at the end of Spring Hollow Drive. Dylan, just 17 at the time, was adjusting to the transition like any teenage boy might, confused, cautious, and slightly cold. He'd spent most of his life without a consistent mother figure, and now this vibrant, flirtatious woman had entered his world, calling herself mom without ever earning the title. Angela, however, wasn't interested in slow introductions or building trust over time. She moved in quickly, both emotionally and physically. Almost overnight, she began reshaping the home. New furniture, different rules. She decorated Dylan's room without asking, threw out old photos of his biological mother, and insisted they all have family dinners every evening whether Dylan wanted to or not. Angela paid him too much attention. She complimented him in strange ways. She laughed too hard at his jokes, stood too close when talking, and constantly found reasons to touch his arm or shoulder. At first, Dylan dismissed it as harmless awkwardness. He assumed she was just trying too hard, but it didn't stop. It intensified. She'd knock on his door late at night with snacks or come into the bathroom without knocking. She started buying him cologne, clothing, and even underwear, things that made him feel increasingly uncomfortable. But with his father working double shifts and rarely home, Dylan kept it to himself. He didn't want to create tension. He certainly didn't want to sound paranoid. Angela's obsession with Dylan didn't go unnoticed entirely. Teachers at Dylan's high school noticed his grades slipping and his behavior becoming erratic. A neighbor once mentioned seeing Angela drive Dylan home from school when he usually took the bus, only for her to linger in the driveway with him for far too long. Still, no one intervened. By the time summer arrived, Dylan had stopped hanging out with his friends and was barely speaking to his father. Angela had inserted herself as the center of his world. What no one realized was that behind closed doors, she had begun crossing lines that should never be crossed, lines between parent and child, between adult and minor, between love and obsession. Angela's grip on Dylan wasn't just physical, it was psychological. She began reshaping his view of the world. She told him his friends didn't care about him, that his biological mother had abandoned him, and that his father was too preoccupied with work to ever truly understand him. She slowly isolated him from everyone he had known. Bit by bit, she carved out a mental space where only she existed. To an outsider, it might have looked like a troubled teenager and an overbearing stepmom. But the truth was far more sinister. Angela would cry when Dylan tried to pull away. She would claim he was the only person who made her feel alive, that they were soulmates in a world that didn't understand them. She planted the idea that love wasn't about titles or a jit, was about connection. And when Dylan, still a boy, still vulnerable, pushed back, she used emotional blackmail. She told him she'd kill herself if he ever told anyone what was happening. Trapped in a storm of manipulation, shame, and confusion, Dylan started breaking down. At school, he became withdrawn. He stopped turning in assignments. His attendance became spotty. His former friends said he looked pale, distracted and scared. Yet he never spoke up. His silence became his prison. His father, James, remained blind to it, believing Angela's excuses that Dylan was just going through a rough patch, typical teenage rebellion. She covered all the tracks, deleting messages, setting up fake email accounts, and locking her phone with passwords only she knew. But secrets don't stay hidden forever. One night, James returned home early from work to find Dylan's bedroom door locked. He knocked. No answer. He forced it open and found Angela sitting on the bed beside Dylan, both startled, too close for comfort. What he saw didn't make sense. It's Angela wearing one of Dylan's hoodies, candles burning, music playing softly in the background. It looked like a date, not a parenting moment. James exploded with questions, but Angela didn't hesitate. She turned the story on its head. She told James that Dylan had become obsessed with her, that he was unstable, that he had made advances toward her. James, in shock and disbelief, didn't know what to think. The next day, Angela made sure Dylan was gone. She insisted he move in with his biological mother. She painted it as the best thing for everyone's safety. Dylan didn't fight. He packed a bag and left without a word. No one knew the truth. No one knew that the boy being accused was the victim. She stayed behind, painting herself as the wounded party, the betrayed stepmother trying to protect her home. But her obsession hadn't ended. It had only gone underground. 2 years had passed since. Dylan had been forced to leave the home where his life had quietly unraveled. Now 19, he lived with his mother in a nearby town, trying to rebuild a sense of normalcy. He attended community college part-time, worked evening shifts at a gas station, and avoided all talk of his father or Angela. He rarely spoke about that chapter of his life. Those memories sat inside him like a locked drawer, too shameful, too complicated, too dangerous to open. But Angela had never truly let go. In the months after Dylan left, her marriage to James collapsed. Accusations flew, trust shattered, and the once functional home disintegrated. James moved out, filed for divorce, and cut contact. Angela, now in her mid-30s, was left in the house alone without a husband, without a stepson, and without anyone to keep her obsession in check. Angela changed her hair, altered her social media, and began creating fake profiles, desperate to keep tabs on Dylan from a distance. When stalking no longer satisfied her, she reached out under a false identity. Using a generic female name and photos taken from strangers online, she began messaging Dylan. She flattered him. She asked about his dreams. She pretended to be a new, unrelated person, someone safe. When Dylan finally agreed to meet her in person, the truth emerged. It should have ended there, should have walked away. But the emotional web Angela had spun years ago hadn't unraveled. It had simply been waiting for its chance to pull him back. Dylan didn't tell anyone that he had met up with Angela again. He didn't tell his mother. He didn't tell his friends. And he certainly didn't tell the therapist he'd been assigned during his school's mandatory wellness program. Kept it buried, just like he always had. A month later, Dylan moved into Angela's new apartment under the pretense of being roommates. She had relocated to a small rental on the outskirts of Dayton, far from familiar faces. The neighbors thought it strange an older woman and a much younger man living together, but people minded their business. Inside the apartment, the power dynamic returned instantly. Angela resumed her manipulation, this time under the guise of romantic love. She told Dylan they were equals now, that they no longer had to hide, that their connection was destiny. Destiny quickly turned into domination. Angela monitored his every move. She controlled his schedule, questioned his interactions with coworkers, and accused him of cheating if he so much as looked at another woman. Her behavior spiraled into paranoia. She threatened self-harm when he tried to leave the apartment. She would sit by the door, blocking his exit, weeping and making promises she never kept. Dylan found himself trapped all over again, this time, not as a child in a family home, but as an adult in a prison of guilt and manipulation. No one knew the truth, not his coworkers, not the landlord, not his mother, who still thought he was. Just renting a place with a friend from college, Angela controlled the narrative, just like always. And then came the breaking point. On a chilly March night, things came to a head. The tension between Angela and Dylan had been building for weeks. Angela had discovered flirtatious messages on Dylan's phone from a girl he met at work. She flew into a rage, accusing him of betrayal, of abandonment, of choosing her over the person who had loved him all along. Dylan tried to leave the apartment to cool down, but Angela blocked the door. She screamed, cried, begged, then retreated into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her. According to the 911 call placed by Dylan at 1:43 a.m., he heard a loud bang and found Angela collapsed on the floor with a gunshot wound to her chest. He claimed she had killed herself. The emergency responders found him shaking and disoriented, sitting on the living room floor, unable to speak in full sentences. Angela was pronounced dead at the scene. At first glance, it seemed like a suicide, a tragic end to a volatile relationship. But investigators weren't convinced. The position of Angela's body, the trajectory of the bullet, and the fact that there was no gunpowder residue on her hands all raised questions. The gun was found on the floor several feet away, wiped clean of fingerprints. There was no suicide note, and Dylan's story began to shift with every retelling. When detectives interviewed him, he claimed he hadn't been in the room. Later, he said he'd tried to wrestle the gun from her and had accidentally discharged. Then he said he blacked out and couldn't remember anything. The inconsistencies piled up. His phone showed texts he had sent earlier that night to a friend, saying, "I can't do this anymore and she's going to ruin my life again." Those messages, combined with his changing story and the forensic evidence, pointed to something darker. Angela hadn't ended her own life. She had been shot intentionally. Dylan was arrested for second-degree murder. The arrest sent shockwaves through the community. For the first time, the public learned about the disturbing history between Dylan and his stepmother. News outlets picked up the story, calling it everything from a forbidden romance gone wrong to the most twisted family tragedy of the decade. But no one really knew what to make of it. Was Dylan a murderer? Or was he the final victim of a woman who had manipulated him for years? The trial began 7 months later, under the glare of public fascination. Courtrooms were packed. Reporters jostled for seats. Dylan sat at the defense table, pale and silent, dressed in an oversized suit that made him look younger than his age. The prosecution laid out their case, methodically establishing motive, opportunity, and intent. They painted Dylan as a man who had finally snapped under pressure, choosing violence over escape. They presented forensic evidence, ballistic reports, and the eerie absence of gunpowder residue on Angela's hands. To them, this was a classic domestic homicide. But the defense had a different story. They introduced years of manipulation and emotional abuse. They brought in school counselors, former teachers, and even family friends who testified about Angela's unsettling behavior when Dylan was a teen. A forensic psychologist explained how years of control had warped Dylan's perception of right and wrong, that the relationship wasn't consensual, it was a long-term form of captivity, that the shooting, while tragic, had been the breaking point of a deeply abused mind. Photos from Dylan's childhood were shown. Journal entries Angela had kept were uncovered, revealing fantasies of a life where age and rules don't matter. The courtroom grew quiet as excerpts were read aloud. It became clear that this wasn't just about a young man and a jealous partner. It was about years of power imbalance, exploitation, and silence. In the end, the jury deliberated for 3 days. When they returned, they delivered a verdict of guilty but not of murder. Dylan was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, with the court acknowledging the psychological abuse and long-term trauma he had endured. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison with the possibility of parole in 10. The story faded from headlines within weeks, but its implications lingered, raised questions about grooming, male victims of abuse, and the unseen damage that can fester behind suburban walls. Angela was buried quietly. No family came forward to claim her belongings. Dylan, now in his early 20s, remains behind bars, still processing what happened, still grappling with the line between victim and perpetrator. To this day, many argue about who is to blame. Some say he was a murderer who used his trauma as a shield. Others believe he was a boy broken beyond repair long before the trigger was pulled. But one thing remains clear. What happened between Angela and Dylan should never have happened at all. And had someone spoken up earlier, had someone seen the signs, maybe none of it would have turned deadly.